Next up, a man who really needs no introduction, Randal O'Toole from the Cato Institute. And Randal is going to talk about something I think is really interesting, but basically turning the disparate impact analysis that our friends on the left are often so fond of on its head to promote housing affordability. Randal?
Thank you. Now, I think we held our first conference in 2003 in Washington, D.C., and at that time we decided our goal was to promote mobility and affordable home ownership. What are we doing here? Okay. We've had some influence on mobility. We've stopped light rail lines in Austin and St. Petersburg and streetcar lines in various places. I hope that the American Dream Coalition has helped the people who have done that work. I'm really proud of the fact that we've had that influence. On the other hand, on housing, on land use, we have had zero influence at all. We have had no effect on all the things that Wendell just told us about. And that is very disappointing, and I think it's about to change. It's about to change because of a Supreme Court ruling made last June that you may not have heard of because it was made the same day as the Obamacare ruling and the day before the gay marriage ruling, and those got a little more attention. If you have heard about it, probably what you heard was bad. The ruling has to do with fair housing. In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, and it made illegal what the lawyers call disparate treatment. Now, I would call it different treatment, but for some reason, lawyers have to speak a different language, so it's disparate treatment. That means if you say you own a house and you want to rent it to somebody, and you say you'll only rent it to blacks, or you'll only rent it to whites, or you'll only rent it to Asians, that's disparate treatment. That's illegal, okay? Now, since that law was passed, there's been a new interpretation of it that's been expanded slowly by the Supreme Court and by housing activists called disparate impact. Disparate impact says if you have a policy that you may have no intention of discriminating against people, but if it effectively does, that has a disparate impact on protected minorities, and that's as illegal under the Fair Housing Act as disparate treatment. The Supreme Court decided, yes, that could be just as illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a higher percentage of blacks smoke than whites. Just to use an ordinary picture of a black man smoking, right? Let's say a higher percentage of blacks smoke than whites, and let's say you own an apartment building and you decide you want to have a no smoking policy for all of your apartments to make them more rentable when the current renters leave. You won't have to clean them out, fumigate them, whatever. Well, if a higher percentage of blacks and whites smoke, your no smoking policy could have a disparate impact on blacks. And that could be illegal under the Fair Housing Act, and you would have to go through, you could be sued for it. So there's a lot of people resisting the disparate impact policy. However, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development published rules on disparate impact actually 2 years before the Supreme Court made its decision, and their rules only go after two different types of entities. First of all, lenders who might be doing redlining or something else to say certain neighborhoods are off limits, we're not going to lend in those neighborhoods, and if those neighborhoods are mainly occupied by blacks or another protected minority, that could have a disparate impact. The other party they're going after is local governments or state governments. Any land use rules, ordinances, policies, or procedures that could have a disparate impact are illegal under fair housing law. Now, those policies generally are policies that increase housing costs because blacks have about 59% the per capita income of whites. So if you increase housing costs, you're going to have a disparate impact on blacks. You'll probably have a disparate impact on Latinos. You may have a disparate impact on other minorities. So for example, cities in California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Florida, and a few other states have drawn urban growth boundaries, urban, as Wendell calls it, urban containment. Under the Fair Housing Act, those urban growth boundaries are illegal, or probably illegal. We need to go to court to verify this, but I assert they're illegal. A number of cities have passed what are called inclusionary zoning ordinances. That's where they've drawn urban growth boundaries. The price of housing has shot up because of those evil developers taking advantage of people's willingness to pay through the nose for housing. So they're going to force the developers to sell or rent 15 to 20% of the dwellings they develop at less than market cost to compensate for the high prices. Well, of course, the developers therefore charge more for the rest of the housing they built, and owners of existing homes see that the price of new housing has gone up, so they raise their prices, so everybody ends up paying more except for the few lucky people, which is less than 5% of new homes in California. And so inclusionary zoning, or mandatory affordable housing, is also has a disparate impact and is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. You've probably heard of Suzette Kelo and how her working class neighborhood was taken by the city of New London for the purpose of giving it to a developer who would build an upper middle class neighborhood that would pay more taxes. The Supreme Court approved this decision. They were explicit in their approval that taking this land from this private party and giving it to another private party had an explicit public purpose, which was to increase the tax revenues to the city of New London. Okay? Well, but under the disparate impact doctrine, increasing the cost of housing in order to increase your tax revenues has a disparate impact on low-income people and therefore is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Rent control is supposed to make rent more affordable, but it only makes rent more affordable for the people who are already renting, because builders stop building housing, rental housing, when you've got rent control, because they don't want to be regulated. So you end up making new renters come in, pay a lot more. It makes it less affordable. That has a disparate impact. I don't have a picture. Boulder, Colorado has a slow growth policy. Their slow growth policy says they're only going to issue something like 1.5% new building permits a year. That is, if they have 100,000 homes, they're only going to issue 1,500 new building permits this year. That has a disparate impact. It's made Boulder the least affordable city that's not on a coastal state in the country. So that's illegal under the Fair Housing Law. Impact fees. We were talking about impact fees this morning and how Austin charges a whopping $7,800 a dwelling unit compared to Houston, which is only $1,800 a dwelling unit. On the other hand, Portland is $50,000 to $60,000. California is probably a lot more. Impact fees not only make the cost of new housing more expensive, but like the tide that raises all boats, it makes existing housing more costly, because the existing homeowners say, hey, look, a new house suddenly costs $50,000 more. We can raise the price of our house by $50,000. And so you get a windfall for existing homeowners who tend to be white, middle class, and you get a disparate impact on lower income people and on minorities. So that's illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Now, I say it's illegal, but we have to test it, and we have ways of doing that. But to tell you what the federal government is doing is they're focusing on one aspect of this. They have a policy, a regulation that they put out just a couple weeks after the Supreme Court decision called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And what this rule is, it's a rule that says if you have a neighborhood that's kind of segregated, there's very few blacks in it, there's very few Latinos, we're going to force you to integrate by building high-density housing. The theory being that high-density housing costs less, and so it's more affordable, and so therefore you'll be able to get more lower-income minorities in your neighborhood. Now, the reality is that high-density housing costs more per square foot than low-density housing, especially if it's multi-story, 4 to 5 story or more, and this is what they want to build, is 4 to 6 story buildings. So you end up spending more. The only way it's more affordable is if you end up being willing to accept smaller dwelling units. So you get an 1,100 square foot apartment instead of a 2,200 square foot house, and it costs you the same. And so affirmatively furthering fair housing, the theory is that housing is fair if blacks and Latinos live in high-density housing in cramped quarters with little privacy like this, whereas whites live in housing like this. That's perfectly fair as long as it's all in the same city. So therefore, it's integrated. But if they're in different cities, it's not fair. Well, I don't think that's the way to go about it, but fortunately, we don't have to rely on the federal government. We can bring our own disparate impact cases, and the disparate impact rule set by the Federal Department of Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, sets out a process for challenging these rules. First, we need to show that a policy has a disparate impact on minorities. And if we show that that policy leads to housing prices being more expensive and minorities are less affluent, then that we've done our burden of proof. Then the instigator of that policy gets to respond by saying, yes, maybe it makes it more expensive, but we have legitimate, sufficient legal justification for doing it because we're stopping global warming, or we're protecting farmland, or we're doing something else. We're stopping teenage suicides, anything that the smart growth people say their policies do. So then we get to come back and say, okay, maybe you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there's a lot more effective ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that cost less and do not have disparate impacts on minorities. And if we can make that case, then we win. Now, we look around the country. Guess what is the most racist urban area in the United States based on the actual effects of their policies, not based on their intentions?
Austin.
Nope. Actually, Austin is pretty high. The most racist is San Francisco. San Francisco, between 2000 and 2010, grew by nearly 300,000 people. This is the San Francisco-Oakland urban area, and lost 49,000 blacks. 49,000 blacks net moved out. Los Angeles actually lost more. They lost about 79,000 blacks, but their population didn't grow as much. So the difference between the growth in overall population and this shrinkage of the black population wasn't as great. Austin, interestingly, grew really fast, but the population of blacks didn't grow. It grew, but it didn't grow as fast as the overall growth. So there was some kind of a disparate impact in Austin, whereas Houston and Dallas, the population of blacks grew faster than the population of everybody, which is the national trend. Between 2000 and 2010, nationwide, we grew by 9%, blacks grew by 11%. So blacks have been growing slightly faster. So what I'm saying is we should bring our initial cases in one of these areas where black populations are definitely declining, where they're declining because of housing affordability problems, and because those housing affordability problems are brought about by these policies, rent control, inclusionary zoning, urban containment, we can get rid of all of these policies. So I hope that you'll all go home and think about bringing these lawsuits. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of people from California this year. Last year we had a lot of them because they were all fired up about stopping Plan Bay Area. They failed to stop it, and now we have the tools to stop it, and they aren't here. But we'll let them know, and I hope that you'll be able to work on this as well. Thank you very much.